43 small marks scratched into pale limestone 7 by 7. Week by week, each line a day, no one on the surface could hear. A shard of mirror leaned against the rock, waiting for light that never quite reached it. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I've lived most of my life under the long shadow of the San Francisco peaks, where mornings begin with the smell of cold pine and the rumble of freight trains pushing through town like a heartbeat. Spring in Flagstaff comes in fits snowmelt running down gutters at dawn, sun strong by lunch. A sharp wind by late afternoon that flips porch flags and makes wind chimes speak. My days were steady then. Paperwork at a desk scarred by other people's coffee mugs. Calls in the truck with the radio muttering dispatch codes I'd long since learned to translate into faces and places. When the roads were dry, I ate my sandwich behind the station and watched the light change on the red rock to the north, the canyon sitting out there like a long-held secret that could still surprise you if you got careless. Our office sits a mile or so from the courthouse, a squat building with thin carpet and a pot of coffee that never tastes like coffee. There was a rhythm to our spring visitors arriving a little early, hikers drifting through with sunburned noses and clean boots, guides filling the lobby with trail talk, and the rangers on the phone with the patient tone of men and women who know exactly how far a mile feels when you're out of water. By March, you could feel the town stretching toward summer, the ice cream shop near the tracks setting out its benches again, school kids riding their bikes without gloves, and the university kids spread like river stones on the quad. Books open legs bare to the sun. That week I was juggling a petty theft case and a bar fight that only turned serious because somebody threw a glass. I'd been to the South Rim twice for briefings. Those were always plain and useful. Remind folks to file a plan, carry enough water. Respect the heat even when the day starts cool. The ranger station at the Rim is a place I trust. There's a reassuring scuff to the floor, a long counter peppered with maps, and a poster on the wall that says, "Plan for the climb out." The people there measure the world in switchbacks and hours of daylight and the angle of shade at noon. I've learned to listen to them. Hannah Cole came through on a Wednesday morning with 4 friends, and that particular brightness college kids carry in spring. The station door swung open, and in they came, laughter squeezed quiet in a room where other people were concentrating on maps. I recognized her from the university's volunteer roster she'd helped on a creek cleanup the previous fall, handing out buckets and gloves and telling jokes to a group of 8th graders until they stopped complaining and started hauling trash. She had a way of making responsibility feel like a good idea. She gave me a polite nod, the kind you offer someone you've seen at a distance, and laid out her permit packet for the ranger. Jack Dalton stood next to her, tall, even-toned, the kind of kid who checks the spare batteries twice. He set down a small, beat-up notebook like it was his second wallet. Behind him, Evan Walker held a rock hammer and a grin, explaining something about limestone layers to Bella, who had a pencil tucked behind her ear and a camera closed tight in her bag to save the battery. Cora Blackwell hovered a half-step back, eyes moving quickly, taking in the line of boot prints on the floor mat, the shade of the ranger's hat brim, the way the maps were folded, all the details some people never notice. They didn't know me beyond a nod, and I didn't know them beyond their public selves, permits, filed safety meeting, attended water amounts, discussed. I watched from the side as the ranger went through the checklist itinerary, planned camps, expected return at 6 p.m. on the 15th, weather clear, with a taste of wind. Hannah signed. Jack initialed. Cora stood on her toes to see the map better and traced a finger along the contour lines out toward Hermit Creek, where the world falls away in steps made of time itself. Flagstaff ain't a big town in the ways that matter. You see the same faces reassembled in different places, the grocery, the gas station, the diner off Route 66 where the coffee is thin but hot. That afternoon I passed Bella and her mother in aisle 7 by the colored pencils. They were choosing a set with a clean white box, the kind that promises colors with names like Juniper Canyon Dusk and Sunrise. Her mother pushed the cart with both hands, and Bella tucked the box under her arm like a small treasure. They talked about sunscreen and a sun hat. Ordinary soft talk, the kind that sounds like a life going on. Evan's name popped up in my head later that day when I signed into the museum for a short talk on public safety. He'd been at one of those sessions the prior semester asking me afterward if rangers ever used ground-penetrating radar for searches. He said it lightly, curious, not pushing. I told him that out here we use what works the old-fashioned boot and the helicopter when we have it, whatever new tool proves itself. He nodded the way a geology kid nods, filing away the information as if each fact were a specimen to be labeled and shelved. My own life in those days was plain and decent. I'd go home to a one-story house south of town, a yard half rocks and half grasses that don't mind thin soil. The porch light is a stubborn thing. I leave it on longer than necessary when the days run short. My neighbor, Mr. Rounds, still waves from his driveway in a windbreaker he refuses to replace. I cook simple beans chicken, a salad that makes me feel virtuous, and stack dishes next to the sink until there are enough to wash without wasting water. The sound of tires over gravel on my street is a comfort. It means folks are home where they belong. When I think of that week now, 2 small moments nudge forward as if they knew before I did. The first, a voicemail at 8:12 p.m. from the campus recreation office reminding leaders to update any route changes with the ranger station, part of a routine round-robin they do each spring, a script no one notices until it's needed. The second, a breeze at the rim the morning they set out that lifted Hannah's hair and flipped the corner of Jack's folded map. He smoothed it with the flat of his hand and laughed at himself for guarding a piece of paper like it was gold. Nothing ominous. Just regular life making its quiet notes. The day before they left, the temperature held steady in the mid-60s. People in town smiled more freely. Folks wore short sleeves to the grocery like they were announcing the season's change. I stopped at the hardware store for a new flashlight and ran into Ranger Tom Mitchell, a man who measures his words. He was picking up replacement cord and talked about a spring training with the new recruits, how they were decent with rope and better with patience. We stood in the narrow aisle between rakes and shovels and spoke in the shorthand of people who've seen the same kinds of bad days. Check your knots. Drink early, drink often. The canyon gives you warnings if you're listening. That evening, I drove past the university. In a courtyard near the library, a string of cafe lights clicked on as the sun leveled out, turning everything the color of warm copper. A band practiced on the grass, tinny too fast, and laughter lifted above the notes like birds startled into flight. I pictured those 5 in their dorms or apartments, laying out gear on beds the way hikers do, socks, stacked headlamps, checked batteries, counted food, lined up like a small inventory of optimism. I've done the same on my own living room floor, counted my own water bottles, clipped the whistle to the strap where I can find it. There's comfort in order. At dusk, clouds collected over the peaks, thin as gauze. The forecast stayed steady, clear a whisper of wind, no storms rolling in. Trail conditions posted at the station read like good news. No ice on the main corridor, lingering patches in shaded slots, water flowing where expected. The only caution was the one that's always there, the one carved into the way we talk about this place. It's easier walking down than up. Plan your climb out. It's the canyon's oldest lesson, and still people forget. Hannah sent a text to a friend just before turning in a photo of a folded permit with the corner of her day pack in the frame, a caption that said simply, South Rim sunrise, then miles. Jack set an early alarm. He was the sort to give himself a buffer and then a buffer for the buffer. Evan cleaned the face of his rock hammer and tucked it into a side pocket where it wouldn't bang his knee. Bella rubber-banded her pencils together and chose one small sketchbook instead of 2. Cora checked her camera settings in the bathroom mirror, turned the camera off, then on again, and finally off, saving the battery like a miser with coins. 5 small lives arranging themselves toward a plan. The morning they left, I woke to the smell of cold in the air and the quiet thud of the paper landing against my porch. The sun came up gentle. I drove north behind a pickup with 2 mountain bikes lashed to its rack and a red bandana tied to the frame because the owner cared about the people driving behind him. At the rim, the parking lots began to fill the way a pond gathers ducks. Early heat rose from the pavement in waves too small to see, but easy to feel in your bones. Tourists in new boots posed for pictures, arms slung over shoulders, everyone leaning back like they could hold the whole canyon in the window of a phone. I signed the log at the station, left a form on a desk, and stepped out to the overlook for a minute just to breathe. Wind came up from the inner gorge, cool as a cellar. Somewhere far below, a raven angled on a draft like a piece of paper tossed from a high shelf. The rock faces looked close enough to touch and older than anything I could name. If you've stood there, you know the way your chest tightens, some mix of admiration and the quiet adult recognition that you're the fragile thing in the picture. I saw them once more that morning, not up close, just a glimpse across the lot. 5 packs upright on the ground like a row of patient animals. 5 young people adjusting straps and grinning that little shake you do before you set off to let the body know it's time for work. Jack checked the batteries. Evan clapped him on the shoulder. Bella twisted her hair into a knot and threaded a pencil through it. Cora lifted her camera, thought better of it, and set it back down with a tender tap. Hannah looked at the map, then at the sky, then at the people she'd chosen to walk beside. Small things. True things. The start of a day you'd expect to end with sore legs and a hot meal. Back in town, the day went on. I ate my lunch on the tailgate and listened to a ball game on low, the announcer's voice, a warm, steady presence. The afternoon shift passed in the familiar shuffle of forms and calls and quick, forgettable conversations. Around 4, a gust came through that rattled the station windows and set a single paper drifting edgewise across the floor. I bent and caught it before it slipped under the copier. A nothing moment. A small breeze carrying nothing more than dust. I left the office at 6, drove the long way home along the stretch where the road opens to a view of the peaks. The last light ran thin across the top ridges, turning the highest snow a blue that never lasts. I flipped my porch light on even though I didn't need it yet, a habit I picked up when my kid sister had late shifts and I wanted her to see the house from the corner. I boiled water for tea and stood at the sink while the kettle ticked toward a whistle. Somewhere down the block a screen door creaked and settled. The evening was unremarkable in all the ways that mean you are safe. At 7:15 the phone on my kitchen counter buzzed with a message from a ranger I didn't open. It could wait until morning. I thought something about a training schedule or a permit number that needed correcting. The tea went into a chipped mug and I sat at the table with my notebook and a pencil, the porch light throwing a soft circle onto my steps. Out past town, beyond the line where the pines thin into stone, the canyon held its breath the way it always does at night, and somewhere on a road toward the rim a pair of headlights should have rounded the bend and didn't. I let the kettle cool and waited for nothing in particular, not knowing that a simple check mark on a ranger's clipboard would stay empty longer than anyone expected. It started with a phone call that didn't sound urgent, just a ranger's voice, steady as always, saying a group hadn't checked back in from Hermit Creek. It was late evening on the 15th, that stretch of twilight when the sky goes from coral to the dark blue. That means it's time to head home. I was still at my desk when the message came through, half reading a report that would keep till morning. Missing hikers aren't uncommon in the canyon. The difference is how long before they're found. Most show up within a few hours, sunburned, embarrassed, dehydrated. But this one had weight from the start. When I heard the name Hannah Cole, I remembered her bright grin at the ranger station. I hung up, locked the office, and headed straight to the rim. By the time I reached the command post near Hermit's Rest, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped hard. You could smell the change dust and cold mixing in the dark. Rangers were already forming teams, laying out maps under the glow of a generator lamp. The details came quick and precise. 5 students from Northern Arizona University experienced well-equipped due back 6 hours ago. Their vehicle still parked where they'd left it, keys and paperwork sealed in a glove box. The ranger, Tom Mitchell, ran me through their itinerary. They'd planned to camp near Hermit Creek for 2 nights, hike back up on the 3rd. They'd logged their route, checked conditions, done everything right. And yet, as midnight came and went, not a word from them. We launched the first search before dawn. The canyon at that hour is silent in a way that can rattle your chest, a stillness too big for one person to hold. Our headlamps bobbed along the trail, catching dust in the air like sparks. Down below, the river's distant roar carried up through the dark like a heartbeat. We split into 2 teams, one following their marked trail, the other sweeping side paths where hikers sometimes wander for photos or shade. By sunrise, a helicopter was in the air, tracing the rim with its spotlight, searching for movement or color that didn't belong. Nothing. No fresh tracks, no broken brush, no echo when we called. Mid-morning brought the first strange find, their campsite sitting perfectly intact, as if they'd stepped away mid-breakfast. The tents were zipped open, sleeping bags smoothed out. A pot on the rock still held a crust of dried oatmeal spoon inside. Nearby, their gear lay arranged with a kind of casual order that told me they hadn't been in distress when they left. Hannah's notebooks were stacked neatly beside her pack. Evan's rock samples sat in a small line like he'd been studying them. Bella's sketchbook lay open to half a drawing pencil, paused halfway through the curve of a canyon wall. Jack's GPS and backup radio rested inside his bag, both charged and working. Cora's camera case sat near the edge of the tarp, the zipper pulled halfway closed. It looked like they'd meant to come back any minute. We photographed everything, tagged each item, but it still felt like trespass. 5 young lives suspended in that clearing, everything waiting for their return. I crouched by the camp stove, brushing my fingers over the cold metal. They'd last cooked something that morning, or maybe the night before. That was the last clear trace we had. As the sun climbed, heat bled into the air. The canyon can turn cruel fast. What's cool and crisp at dawn becomes a furnace by noon. We extended the search perimeter, spreading out across gullies and side ravines where inexperienced hikers sometimes slip. But these kids weren't green. Every sign at their camp spoke of discipline, gear-checked waste, buried footprints, organized. It didn't add up. For the next 72 hours, the canyon became a grid of voices and rotor wash. Helicopters flew low and slow, their blades chopping the silence. Volunteers came in from as far as Nevada, climbers, hikers, people who'd read the headlines. We ran dogs along creek beds and dry washes. Every evening, families gathered at the ranger station, sitting in a half circle around a folding table where we updated them on what we hadn't found. Mothers asked the same questions in the same quiet tone had we checked the water sources, the caves, the ledges. We had. And we would again. By the end of that week, the canyon had swallowed them whole. No torn fabric, no dropped phone, no footprint outside their camp. Just wind and silence and the echo of 5 names we kept repeating so they wouldn't disappear into paper. When a case drags past the first month, the canyon takes on its own rhythm, ranger rotations, new theories, the uneasy shift from rescue to recovery. But their parents never gave up. Each spring they came back, setting up banners at the trailhead, walking the same miles we had, hoping the land would give up what it had taken. I saw them each year, faces, thinner voices, steadier. They spoke less about finding the kids alive and more about just finding something. A jacket, a piece of rope, anything that could anchor their grief to a fact. Then 5 years passed. Files went cold, photos yellowed at the edges, but the story never really left. Around town, people still spoke of them in the present tense. Those students, they'd say. The ones from NAU. The canyon kept its secrets, and we learned to live beside the not knowing. That changed in early 2016. I was in Flagstaff on an ordinary February morning when my phone rang. The voice on the line belonged to Dr. Amanda Reeves, a geologist I'd met years earlier during a mine collapse case. She sounded composed, but there was something beneath her tone that made my pulse shift. She said she and her research partner, Kyle Morrison, had been running ground scans on a remote section of the Tonto platform. What they'd found wasn't geological. She didn't say much, just that her radar was showing voids 30 feet below surface with what looked like synthetic material scattered inside. By dusk, I was on a helicopter headed toward their coordinates about 2 miles southeast of Hermit Creek, in a stretch so barren even the scrub gave up trying. The air was thin sharp with sand. The landscape looked like another planet's stone, split and tilted. Juniper twisted into shapes that looked like grief. Dr. Reeves met me by her equipment wind pulling at her ponytail. She handed me a printout, lines and shadows I could barely read. But even I could tell the cavity beneath us wasn't natural. It had right angles, a depth inconsistent with erosion. She pointed to the ground near a cluster of boulders. "There's an entrance," she said quietly. Or there was. It took another 3 hours before we found it, a narrow crack between 2 slabs of limestone barely 3 feet wide. From above, it looked like nothing, just another shadow. We dropped a flashlight tied to a rope. It fell 80 feet before hitting stone. The beam swung back and forth, catching on what looked like fabric. The air coming from that opening was cold and still, the kind that carries the smell of time itself. Dust minerals, a faint sweetness, like old paper. We called in technical rescue. Ranger Tom Mitchell arrived by chopper just before dark. He was older, heavier, but his eyes were the same steady blue they'd been the night he'd first led the search. When he saw the coordinates, he didn't speak for a moment. 2 miles, he said softly. We were 2 miles off. By sunrise, the team was ready to descend. Tom went first, clipped into the rope, slow and methodical. I followed. The light from our headlamps cut through a shaft so narrow we had to turn sideways to move. At the bottom, the space opened into a chamber big enough to hold a small house. Dust floated through the beams like ghost snow. The first thing I saw was color, a faded blue nylon backpack half buried in sediment. Then another, and another. They were all there. 5 sets of gear, arranged almost neatly in a circle, as if someone had tried to make order of chaos. The air was heavy, dry enough to preserve everything but time. Clothing still held its shape. A camera lay near one pack. Its lens cracked, a film of dust sealing it shut. There was no sign of panic, no struggle. Just quiet, and the weight of realization pressing down until it was hard to breathe. I stepped closer to what had once been their sleeping area, flat stones arranged in a ring, empty water bottles lined against a wall. On the limestone beside it, faint marks caught the light. I brushed them gently with a gloved hand. They weren't random scratches. They were tallies. Dozens of them. 43 in total. Tom's voice came from behind me, low and steady. They made it that long. We stood there in silence. No one spoke for a long while. Everything about the chamber told a story, but not the one we'd wanted. The pattern of the debris, the organization, it all spoke of endurance, not confusion. These kids hadn't died right away. They'd lived down here. They'd waited. That night back at base, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those hash marks, clean and careful, each one a day of hope followed by another. We brought in the forensic team 48 hours later. They worked with reverence, photographing every inch, logging each object as if it were holy. Dr. Sarah Chen led the analysis. When she briefed us the next morning, her face was pale. She said the bodies had been positioned deliberately, 5 of them lying in a circle, heads toward the center. No signs of violence, no evidence of collapse. The cave had been their shelter, not their grave. It only became one with time. From Cora's camera, they recovered over 200 photographs. The earliest showed bright smiles and canyon walls. The later ones told the story we'd missed the fall through that hidden opening, the injuries, the first desperate attempts to climb out. Then the slow shift, hope thinning rations, dividing faces, hollowing. The last images were dim and grainy, lit by a dying flashlight. You could see 3 of them still sitting upright, eyes turned toward a patch of darkness above, as if listening for footsteps that never came. I remember leaving the evidence tent that evening and walking out toward the rim. The sun was setting over the canyon, the light painting everything gold for a brief, merciful minute before fading to ash. Behind me, the wind carried the faint hum of generators, the quiet talk of investigators cataloging what remained. Ahead, the land stretched endless and indifferent. Somewhere down there, in the silence between those walls, 5 young people had believed rescue was on its way. As darkness settled, I thought about how close we'd been, how the helicopters had flown right over that spot 6 times, the crews looking down on what seemed like solid ground, how ground teams had passed within shouting distance, unaware that their voices were echoing through the stone to ears too weak to answer. The canyon has a way of making distance invisible. 100 feet of rock might as well be 100 miles. That night I drove back to Flagstaff in silence. The road was empty, the radio off. In the passenger seat sat a folder of photos we'd printed from Cora's camera. The last one, 2 figures holding hands in the dim light, rested on top. I didn't look at it again. Not yet. When I got home, I didn't turn on the porch light. I sat in my truck until the engine cooled and the night grew still. Somewhere out there beyond the edge of what we could see, the canyon exhaled and held its secrets a little looser. We'd found them, yes. But the why and the how, the small choices that led 5 careful people into that dark chamber, were still out there waiting for us. And I knew before sleep even came that what we'd uncovered wasn't the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning of what the truth would cost. We stayed with the cave for days. There was no rushing something like that. Every inch of that chamber held a clue, and none of us could quite bring ourselves to disturb it until we understood what we were looking at. You could feel it in the air, this strange, reverent quiet that came over everyone once the generators stopped and the flashlights dimmed. Even the younger investigators, who'd only been on the job a few years, carried themselves differently down there, like they'd stepped into a church. I remember kneeling beside one of the packs, brushing a layer of dust away from a zipper that still worked. The nylon gave under my fingers, soft with age, and for a moment I could picture the hand that packed it. Careful young, sure they were ready for anything. That feeling stayed with me, how certain they must have been that they'd come home. Dr. Chen's team took over the forensic mapping. She was methodical, slow, and didn't talk much, which suited me fine. She had that calm that comes from spending a lifetime around hard truths. One evening, as we stood near the entrance shaft, waiting for a sample bag to be lifted out, she said almost to herself, "They lasted 43 days. She wasn't reading from notes. She'd counted the marks by hand twice to be sure. The number landed in my chest like a weight. 43 days. 6 weeks and a day. Long enough for hope to become routine. The next morning, we went through what they'd left behind. You could see how organized they'd been even as the days wore them down. Empty bottles lined in perfect rows. Food wrappers sorted by type. It wasn't just neatness, it was control. When everything else fails, order becomes its own kind of faith. Their notebooks and cameras told the rest. Cora's photos started bright and full of life, the kind you'd expect from a college trip, 5 friends on an adventure, sun flaring through the canyon walls. Then, shot by shot, the light faded. Bruises appeared. Scratches deepened, eyes hollowed out. You could trace the whole ordeal through her lens like a clock ticking down. The first few days after the fall looked almost manageable. They'd found this chamber by accident when the ground beneath them gave way 1 false step, maybe 2, and suddenly they were 70, 80 feet below the surface with no way up. The walls were too smooth for climbing. No rope, no handholds, no sound that carried far enough to bring help. The camera showed the aftermath: Mason sitting against the wall with blood dried at his hairline, Belle's wrist swollen and splinted with fabric from her pack. They'd salvaged what they could from the drop: 2 water bottles, some granola, a handful of supplies, but most of it was gone. At first, they did what anyone would call out, tried to climb waved light toward the gap above. Then the photos began to shift: less action, more endurance. They marked the days with scratches, rationed food, with the precision of people who still believed rescue would come. I'd seen enough survival cases to recognize the pattern: resolve, then fatigue, then something deeper that's hard to describe. It's not surrender exactly. It's a kind of acceptance that sits alongside hope, the two of them fighting quietly for space. When we pulled the memory card from Cora's camera, the lab gave us the sequence within hours. I watched those images in the dim light of the command trailer, one after another, until the walls seemed to close in around me. In the final frames, they're thinner, paler, sitting close for warmth. Their flashlights still work, but the light is weaker yellowed. In one, you can see Hannah and Jack holding hands. In another, Cora's camera faces upward, the entrance just a pale circle of sky. It made me think of something Tom Mitchell said years earlier. The canyon doesn't kill people. It just waits for them to make a small mistake. The evidence told us they'd made that mistake, chasing something harmless, a rumor of petroglyphs posted by someone on a hiking forum. The coordinates were wrong, but close enough to lead them toward that fragile patch of ground. When Jack stepped on the flat stone that covered the shaft, it must have sounded solid. Maybe they even joked about it. Then it broke. Gravity did the rest. Dr. Chen reconstructed their final days in a report that I still keep a copy of. Mason's head injury worsened after the 3rd week. He likely slipped into a kind of half-sleep and never woke up. Belle's infection took her soon after. The others carried on for another week. The medical examiner found traces of dehydration and malnutrition, but also something else: signs of sustained movement, meaning they'd kept trying until their bodies gave out. That part struck me hardest. They didn't just wait to die. They fought for every breath in that cave. As we processed the evidence, the details began to haunt me. The small mirror from Belle's makeup kit positioned beneath the shaft to catch light. The burned edges of textbook paper probably used to start signal fires that couldn't last. Even the arrangement of their bodies, heads inward, hands almost touching, spoke of a unity that didn't break, not even in the end. I've seen cases where fear turns people against each other, but not this one. These kids stayed a team to the last. What crushed me later was learning how close we'd come. Helicopter logs showed 6 flyovers right above that cave during the original search. The opening was too small to notice, camouflaged by a slab of rock that looked like solid ground. Ground teams had walked within 50 yards of it on multiple days. We even had one report from a hiking group that saw flashes of light around noon the 12th day of the search. They'd assumed it was glare from another team's equipment. I checked the logbook myself. Unconfirmed reflection, no follow-up needed. Reading that line now feels like reading a gravestone. After the recovery, the families were told first. We gathered them in a small room at the sheriff's office, blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. I'd been in that room before for other cases, but this time felt different. The parents sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching tissues that couldn't hold the weight of what was coming. I told them what we'd found, careful and steady the way I'd been taught. Still, when the words 43 days left my mouth, one of the mothers made a sound I'll never forget. A quiet gasp that seemed to pull the air right out of the room. That evening, I went back to my truck and sat with the engine off the radio, silent. The smell of red dust clung to my uniform. Out the windshield, the sun was setting over Flagstaff, painting everything gold for a few impossible minutes. I thought about those kids seeing that same light 5 years earlier, laughing as they loaded their packs, unaware that the ground itself would betray them. The canyon gives no warning. It just waits for the moment when someone stops paying attention. The investigation didn't end with the discovery. There were still questions, the kind that gnaw at you because they don't have clean answers. Who posted the coordinates that led them there? Was it a careless mistake or something darker? We traced the user account from that hiking forum, but it had been deleted years earlier. No IP records, no real name, just a ghost in the system. Maybe it was a well-meaning hiker who misread a map. Maybe it was someone who never knew their words had consequences. Either way, the result was the same 5 bright lives gone because of a few bad numbers. In the months that followed, new protocols took shape. The Park Service began using ground-penetrating radar for deep searches, and every unverified report of distress lights had to be investigated within 24 hours. It was a start, but for me it came too late. I kept seeing that mirror, that ring of stones, that last photograph of Hannah and Jack. I could tell myself it was closure, that we'd given the families the truth they deserved. But closure is just a word people use when they're tired of saying, "I don't know." One night after most of the crew had packed up, I walked back to the cave alone. The entrance was cordoned off, ready to be sealed after the final sweep, but I needed one last look. The sky was clear moonlight spilling across the stone. When I stood at the edge and shone my flashlight down, the beam faded before it reached bottom. The darkness looked soft, almost peaceful, but I knew better. I switched off the light and just listened to the wind, to the faint hum of insects, to the sound of my own heartbeat echoing off the rock. For a long moment I imagined their voices rising from below, young and certain, calling for help that never came. Then the wind shifted, carrying the smell of sagebrush from the rim, and the sound was gone. I stepped back, marked the coordinates in my notebook, and left the canyon behind. But even as the helicopter lifted me into the night sky, the image stayed with me, the 5 of them waiting in the dark, believing that any minute now someone would hear them. I still hear them sometimes in the quiet between calls and the low hum of an engine on an empty road. It's not haunting, not exactly. More like a reminder that sometimes the difference between rescue and loss is just a few yards of rock, a single misstep, a radio call ignored. The canyon doesn't forget. It holds everything, echoes secrets, and the silence of those who waited too long. And somewhere beneath that sealed stretch of limestone, those 43 marks remain, counting days that no one else ever will. The day we brought the last of them up from the chamber, the canyon was strangely still. No wind, no birds, just that immense silence that makes you feel small. Even after all my years in the field, I'd never seen a scene so heartbreakingly deliberate, 5 young lives arranged with such quiet care, as if they'd known someone would find them eventually. I stood at the rim while the recovery team loaded the final stretcher. The helicopter blades stirred the dust into pale ribbons that rose, then vanished. When the sound faded, I was left with the ticking of cooling metal and the low hum of the generator behind me. I remember thinking how close they'd been to daylight, just 80 feet of air between them and the world that had stopped looking. Back at the temporary field office, the work turned clinical again. It always does. Evidence logs, photographs, catalog numbers. Dr. Valdez, the medical examiner, arrived that night. Her hair tied back, her voice measured. She'd seen hundreds of canyon deaths, heat stroke falls, dehydration. But nothing like this. The preservation in that cave was remarkable. Every fiber, every fold of fabric still intact. The next morning, she began her examinations in a quiet tent, away from the noise. I didn't stay for the first one. I went out to the overlook instead, where the light was just beginning to touch the far cliffs. That's when it hit me, the cruel symmetry of it all. They had done everything right. Permits, supplies, safety checks, and yet one small choice, one rumor of rock art on an unmarked trail had brought them to that trapdoor. The canyon never warns you. It lets you step into your own ending before you realize the ground's gone. By noon, Valdez called me over. Her report came in pieces, calm and precise, but each word felt heavier than the last. Mason, the geology student, had survived the fall but suffered a skull fracture. She believed he'd lived more than a month after the accident, his decline slow, the kind that steals someone by degrees. Belle's wrist injury had turned septic. Infection spread through her system unstoppable without medicine. The others, Hannah Jack and Cora, had lasted another week. Based on the photos, their attempts to climb never stopped, even after they could barely stand. Later that evening, when the sun dipped and the camp generators began their low hum again, Dr. Chen came by my station. She carried Cora's camera. It had been cleaned just enough to function, and she'd cued the final images on a small monitor. I didn't want to look, but I did. The last photograph nearly broke me. Hannah and Jack side by side holding hands in that dim light. No panic, no terror, just peace. It looked like they'd made a choice to face the dark together. I turned away after that, but the image stayed behind my eyes, printed there like a scar. In the days that followed, we pieced together the timeline as best we could. They'd left their main camp mid-morning, taking only small packs enough for a few hours. The footprints around the site suggested confidence, steady gait, no backtracking. At some point, they'd found that false stone covering the shaft. Maybe they paused to study it. Maybe Jack stepped forward to test its stability. When it gave way, they fell nearly 80 feet straight into that narrow chamber. The miracle was that they survived the drop at all. The tragedy was everything that came after. Their first instinct had been rational. They inventoried supplies, cared for injuries, tried to assess exits. The shaft walls, smooth as glass, offered no hope of climbing. They'd tried creating footholds using Mason's tools, but the limestone just crumbled. They rationed water, rotated watch shifts, scratched marks to track days. Somewhere in those first weeks, the belief in rescue held strong. We found messages scrawled faintly on rock surfaces, words of encouragement, reminders to stay awake, small notes of hope. But as the days stretched on, their writing grew shorter. By the 5th week, only tally marks remained. It was Cora's journal that told the rest. She'd used the margins of a small psychology textbook to record their progress. Her last entry, dated roughly 6 weeks in, was a single line. "Light again today, we answered it." At first, I didn't understand what that meant. Then Dr. Chen showed me a set of reports we'd overlooked from the original search logs of hikers who'd reported seeing flickering lights deep within the canyon walls. They'd been dismissed as reflections from rescue gear, but the dates matched. Those kids had managed to reflect sunlight up through the shaft using their mirrors. They'd been signaling us, and we never saw it for what it was. That realization settled into me like lead. I went back through the flight logs from 2011, 6 passes over that area, helicopters sweeping within 100 feet. We were right there. If the pilot had glanced down at the right second, if one of us had taken that hiker's report seriously, they might have been saved. All those ifs echo even now. The canyon doesn't give second chances. When I briefed the families in Flagstaff, it was the hardest conversation of my career. They gathered around a long table, the afternoon light cutting through half-closed blinds. I laid out the timeline gently, step by step, until I reached the end. No one moved. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was something deeper. Hannah's mother was the first to speak, her voice a whisper. They waited for us. I didn't know what to say because she was right. They had. The department ordered a full internal review after that. Every missed report, every unverified sighting re-examined. It didn't change what had happened, but it forced us to face the truth that a handful of small oversights can turn tragedy into permanence. I sat through those meetings listening to policy changes, knowing they were too late for the ones who'd needed them most. In the weeks after the case closed, I found myself driving out to the rim alone. I'd park by the overlook sit on the hood of my truck and watch the light move down the walls until the shadows swallowed the last gold edges. The canyon at dusk feels endless, but it also feels alive, as if it remembers every voice that ever called out in it. One evening, I brought the letter they'd left behind, a collective note tucked into Hannah's journal, signed in all their handwriting. I'd read it a dozen times, but that night it felt different. They thanked their families, told them not to be angry at fate, and asked that their story be used to teach others. The words were steady, even kind. I folded it carefully and watched the wind catch the corner before tucking it back into its envelope. Soon after, the Park Service began sealing the cave. I wasn't there for the final closure, but I saw photos of it later, a small plaque embedded in the rock, their names etched cleanly, the inscription, "Simple. They never stopped believing in rescue." It's not much, but in a place that vast, even a small marker means something. Before the seal went up, I visited one last time with Ranger Mitchell. He'd aged a decade since the original search, though only 5 years had passed. We stood by the opening in silence, the rope coils beside us, unused now. He looked down into the gap, then at me. "We walked right past them," he said quietly. There wasn't an ounce of self-defense in his tone, just grief, plain and steady. I told him none of us could have known, but he shook his head. "Doesn't matter. The canyon did." Then he turned away and started the climb back to the rim. I stayed behind a few minutes longer, watching the last light fade. The shadows crept up the rock like water rising. Somewhere in that darkness below lay the remains of their final days. Those careful rows of bottles, the small circle of stones, the last mark carved into limestone. I imagined their voices echoing faintly against the walls, not in fear, but in stubborn hope. It's strange how a place can hold so much silence and still feel full of sound. When I finally left that evening, I didn't look back. Some things you have to let rest even when they don't let you. Still, on certain nights when the wind moves through the pines just right, I swear I can hear something faint, a rhythm, a pulse, like the canyon itself breathing in memory of them. It's not haunting exactly, it's more like the land remembering. And sometimes I wonder if that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered by the places we loved, even when those places are the ones that took us. The canyon will outlast every searchlight, every footprint, every echo. But buried beneath that silence is their story, carved deep and permanent, waiting for someone to listen. And I think that's why I keep coming back. Because even after all these years, the canyon still has one more thing to tell. After the cave was sealed, the canyon felt different. The air along the rim carried the same dry sweetness of juniper and dust, but something in it had changed, like the land itself had drawn a deep breath and gone quiet. We all went back to our lives in the weeks that followed, but not one of us was the same. You can't touch something like that, 43 days of endurance carved into stone, and walk away untouched. The families stayed in Flagstaff for a while. They visited the park office daily at first, sitting together in the small conference room where we'd first told them the truth. I remember the way they looked out through the blinds down the hall where the light hit the framed map of the canyon. They didn't ask for explanations anymore. They just wanted to know what would happen next, what could be done with what was left. There's no real answer for that. Some things don't move forward. They just settle like silt in slow water. When the memorial service came, it was simple. A clear morning, no wind. We met at Hermit's Rest, the same trailhead where the students had started. Rangers stood along the path in uniform hats pressed tight to their chests. Families brought photographs, snapshots of laughter sunlight on faces, graduation gowns, a puppy caught mid-leap. We read their names aloud one by one, and the canyon gave nothing back, only the faint echo that always follows human sound there. I think that was the moment everyone finally understood that remembrance would have to replace answers. A few months later, the Park Service announced the changes, the new safety protocols, the ground-penetrating radar, the requirement to verify every report of flashing light or sound, no matter how small. They gave the families a seat at the table during those meetings, not because it could undo anything, but because they had earned that right. I sat in the back and listened. Every new rule felt like an apology none of us could quite say aloud. Dr. Reeves and Dr. Morrison, the geologists who had stumbled on the chamber, stayed in touch for a while. They sent me updates about the research that grew from their discovery, how the technology we'd used there was now standard in certain parks. They told me it was some small comfort to know something good had come from what they'd found. I didn't have the heart to tell them that comfort and regret often live side by side. Ranger Tom Mitchell retired soon after. I visited him once at his home just outside town, where he spent his days tinkering with old radios and fixing fences. We sat on his porch as the light faded, not saying much. Finally, he said, "I still see that crack in the ground when I close my eyes." "You ever have something that just won't fade?" I told him, yes, though I wasn't sure he believed me. Before I left, he pressed an old ranger patch into my hand. "You keep this," he said quietly. Some memories belong to both of us. The investigation officially closed on March 15th, 6 years to the day after they disappeared. I filed the last report that evening, signed my name, and locked the drawer. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the final lines of the letter we'd found in Hannah's handwriting. "If someone finds this, tell them we stayed kind. Tell them we tried." Those words have followed me ever since. They're what I think of when the job feels too heavy, when I start to believe that what we do doesn't matter. Their families went on to start something extraordinary. They called it the Five Friends Foundation, and it's still running today. They fund safety programs for hikers, sponsor equipment for search teams, even provide scholarships for students studying environmental science. I've been to a few of their events over the years. It's not a place of sorrow anymore. It's quiet pride, steady and enduring. At one ceremony, Hannah's mother came up to me holding a small photo. It was the one from that last morning, the 5 of them standing at the trailhead, laughing into the sun. "They were so happy," she said. "I just needed someone to remember them that way." I told her I would. And I do. As time passed, the story became part of the canyon's long memory. Hikers still ask about it sometimes, softly, as if afraid of disturbing something sacred. We tell them what matters, that they were prepared, that they were brave, that they took care of each other until the end. We don't speak of tragedy so much as endurance. It's easier to live with that word. A year later, I visited the memorial marker after hours when the crowds had gone and the light had turned gold. It's a small bronze plaque near a juniper tree not far from the rim, their names etched into the surface, the inscription simple and true. They never stopped believing in rescue. Someone had left 5 smooth stones beneath it, one for each of them. I sat on the ground for a long while and watched the sun slip below the horizon. The shadows stretched down into the canyon, long and soft, until they were gone completely. I think that was the first time I felt peace, not the kind that replaces grief, but the kind that lives alongside it. I realized then that their story wasn't just about loss. It was about how far hope can reach, even when no one's there to see it. The following spring, the foundation helped install a new system of emergency beacons across the backcountry. Small metal boxes powered by the sun placed in remote sections of the park. Each one can send a distress signal from even the deepest canyon floor. Every time I see that faint green light blinking in the distance, I think of those kids. I think of that mirror they used to catch the sun, their belief that help might still come. In a way, it finally does. Life moved forward in small ways. Dr. Chen wrote an article about human resilience in confined spaces dedicated to them. Dr. Valdez retired quietly, though she kept the case file on her desk until her last day. The families built new routines, birthdays, anniversaries, moments that still came heavy but less sharp. I stayed in the department until my own retirement last year. When I cleaned out my office, I found the patch Tom had given me and a faded map of the canyon with their route still marked in red. I folded it neatly and took it home. Sometimes, when the weather's clear, I drive out to the overlook again. I bring a thermos of coffee and sit on the hood of my truck while the sun climbs over the rim. The light fills the canyon the way it always has, layer by layer. Down there, somewhere beneath all that stone, are their marks on the wall, 43 days of survival carved by human hands. I like to think the earth keeps those safe the same way it keeps fossils or roots or old secrets that aren't meant to disappear. The canyon still draws people from all over the world, and it should. It's beautiful. But I always tell newcomers the same thing. The danger isn't the cliffs or the heat. It's the illusion that the wilderness owes you mercy. It doesn't. What saves you out here isn't luck or strength. It's preparation, respect, and sometimes just telling someone where you're really going. The 5 of them didn't die from recklessness. They died because a single, unseen stone gave way. That's how thin the line is between adventure and tragedy. I used to think closure meant finding answers, but now I believe it's something quieter. It's knowing the story has been told, that someone remembers the names, that a lesson has been written into the landscape for whoever comes next. That's what this case gave me: a deeper respect for the canyon, yes, but also for the stubbornness of hope. Because even when those 5 were trapped in the dark, they still believed someone would find them. In the end, they were right. So when people ask why I keep telling their story, I tell them it's because silence is the canyon's favorite trick. It swallows voices faster than wind. If we don't speak for the ones who vanished, that silence wins. And maybe that's why I'm here tonight sharing this with you. Because somewhere in those quiet rocks beneath layers of red and time, 5 young people are still waiting to be remembered. And the only thing louder than the canyon's silence is our promise not to forget them. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.